completely appropriate.
Speaker.
I call the honourable member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on behalf of the Green Party on the Companies and Limited Partnerships Amendment Bill. The Green Party will be supporting this bill. Mr Speaker, this bill, I think, demonstrates in a way that perhaps few others do about the poor economic management of the government. This is a problem in the New Zealand economy, the problem with regard to the lax law around company registrations. This has been a problem for a number of years in New Zealand. It has resulted in many New Zealand registered companies being engaged in very large-scale tax laundering and fraud internationally. The New Zealand government has been aware of this problem for some time. In fact, under written questions that I put in 2011, the then Minister of Commerce, Simon Power, said that Cabinet had agreed to the proposals to fix this up on the 28th of July 2010. So nearly 2 years ago to the day when Cabinet finally managed to get around to agreeing to do something to fix this major problem, which is damaging New Zealand's international reputation, finally the bill appears in the House. However, in the meantime, so remember the Cabinet decision was on the 28th of July 2010. In 2011, the Green Party got a bit bored waiting for the government to do anything about it and started asking a lot of questions about it and raising the issue in the media because we were concerned about the damage that was happening to New Zealand's international reputation as a result of our very poor company registration process. And we offered to the government at the time that we would support legislation in order to make urgent reforms to company law, reforms that were urgently needed back then in 2011. But the government still did absolutely nothing. Sat on their hands, they were drafting a bill, there was nothing in front of this parliament. And then on February 8th this year, finally, the EU had enough of New Zealand. The European Union decided that it was time to remove New Zealand from the European Union whitelist along with Russia because it was so corrupt. New Zealand because our laws around company registration are so terrible and so weak, and so many New Zealand companies are being used in international fraud. So on February 8th, 2012, New Zealand was removed from the EU whitelist. And now finally, in July 2012, we finally have the bill before Parliament on which the decision was made nearly 2 years ago. Now, if the government had followed the Green Party advice in September last year and actually introduced the legislation that we told them to introduce to tighten up the rules around the registration of companies in New Zealand would not have been removed from the EU whitelist. If the government had not had all sorts of other priorities, mining or whatever, if it had actually focused on making sure that New Zealand businesses, legitimate New Zealand businesses, have a proper regulatory framework in which they're operating, the framework around the registration of companies, then New Zealand businesses would not now be facing the increased cost which this government has imposed on them because of New Zealand's removal from the EU whitelist. And no doubt many other regulatory agencies all around the world are now watching New Zealand companies with distrust because so many New Zealand companies have been involved in fraud and money laundering, companies that are registered in New Zealand but in fact have overseas controllers. So at that time, we told the government that they needed to change the rules, and the government did nothing. So the government sat on its hands, and as a result they have now imposed a whole new layer of cost and regulatory burden on companies, New Zealand companies that are trying to operate internationally because they refuse to introduce the rules that were needed back then to tighten up the registration around New Zealand companies. The problem was, and the problem still is until this law gets changed, that basically you can register a company in New Zealand but you don't have to have a New Zealand-based... A person can register a company in New Zealand, but there is no requirement for that person to have a New Zealand resident administrative agent. What this bill does is begins the process of making sure that the registration of companies in New Zealand meets the bare minimum of good practice internationally. And the fact that the government has delayed this bill for so long, 2 years after Cabinet made the decision, has imposed more costs on New Zealand business as a result of their inaction. The other part of this bill, so aside from requiring a New Zealand resident administrative agent for companies and limited partnerships, this bill also will enhance the company registrar's power to regulate companies and limited partnerships, and it will criminalise some breaches of directors' duties. So what this bill does is start to improve the process of registration of New Zealand companies so that it's harder to register hundreds and hundreds of companies in New Zealand, pick any particular residential address you like, but they're controlled from overseas and then they're used in international criminal activities, which many New Zealand-based companies have been used for. However, this bill, even though the government has sat on its hands for years, even though they knew of the problem, were told of the problem, the Green Party told them what was going on, they did nothing to fix the problem, and so have imposed more costs on New Zealand business, so much for all their rhetoric about decreasing costs, because they don't regulate properly, they add cost to business. And so this bill, even when it's come in, is still quite weak. It falls short of best practice. So this bill does not require registered companies to obtain IRD numbers. This bill does not address the problems around nominee directors. Without addressing these problems, it is an improvement, no question about it, and for that reason we will be supporting this bill. However, it still does not go far enough in terms of international best practice. If we want New Zealand companies to be viewed as credible organisations internationally, we need a regulatory framework in New Zealand that actually makes sure that we have best practice in New Zealand and that companies in New Zealand can't be easily used to engage in international fraud and criminal activity. And that is what has actually been happening in New Zealand. We have had over 2,000 companies have been taken off the companies register because they're probably engaged in illegal activities. No doubt it is a great larger number than that. Certainly in the questions that we put to Simon Power in 2011, he said it was hard to actually know how many New Zealand companies were engaged in this kind of illegal activity internationally. And so when we put these kind of proposals to the National Party, what the National Party says is, oh, that's the nanny state. They go, oh, you can't have proper regulation of companies, that's the nanny state. They go, oh, you wouldn't want to do that, it restricts business. Actually, it's the exact opposite. By having a proper regulatory framework around the registration of companies in New Zealand, we facilitate New Zealand businesses doing their work internationally. And so the fact that National has sat on their hands because of their anti-regulatory knee-jerk reaction to any proper regulatory framework has meant that New Zealand's international reputation has already been damaged because so many New Zealand registered companies have been involved in very large-scale fraud, corruption and money laundering. It means that New Zealand has been taken off the EU whitelist. Thank you very much, Mr Foss and Mr Power, for slowing down this process so much that we've been taken off the EU whitelist, causing more cost for New Zealand companies. And it means that it is harder for businesses in New Zealand to do international business, because no longer do they look at New Zealand businesses and go, well, New Zealand businesses, they're the best in the world, high quality, no corruption. Instead they go, oh, New Zealand businesses, they've been involved in many very prominent international fraud and criminal laundering cases all over the world. And that's why we've been taken off the EU list. So, Mr Speaker, yes, we will be supporting this bill. It is way too late. It is 2 years too late, possibly more. The government had ample opportunity to progress this bill before. We offered the political support to get it through the House. We put pressure on the government, as did others in the media, over a very long period to try to get this law in place. But because the government took so long, our reputation has been damaged and we've been taken off the EU whitelist. We urgently need to fix the law around the registration of companies, and I hope that when this bill goes through Select Committee, we will improve it further, and I hope the government doesn't drag the chain in Select Committee as much as they've dragged the chain between when Cabinet made the decision nearly 2 years ago, 28th of July 2010, nearly 2 years ago they made the decision to actually fix this thing, and yet tonight is the first time we've seen this bill in front of the House. So when the government says, oh, we're all pro-business, they're not really. They're not really. They just got a knee-jerk anti-regulatory response, and the effect of that sometimes is that it makes it very difficult for businesses to operate internationally and adds more cost to them. We actually need a good regulatory framework around the way business operates so that New Zealand businesses can go into the world and people know that our domestic regulatory framework actually stops the kind of corruption, money laundering and criminal activity that we've seen out of New Zealand registered companies that are being actually operated from overseas criminal syndicates. Mr Speaker, we'll be supporting this bill to Select Committee. We hope it improves. Thank you.
I call the honourable member